Well, thank you all for coming to today's 2025 Wayne Morse Chair Lecture, which honors the legendary U.S. Senator, the Tiger of the Senate, and celebrated University of Oregon Law Dean Wayne Morse. It's an honor to partner with the University of Oregon's Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics in co-sponsoring this year's Wayne Morse Chair Address, which is the capstone event for the center's two-year theme of defending democracy. Who knew at the time just how relevant that would be? All right, this theme is a constant feature of the work of the Wayne Morse Center, whose mission is to encourage civic engagement and inspire enlightened dialogue by bringing students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and communities together to discuss public problems affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. It promotes the legacy of Oregon's Senator Wayne Morse by fostering education, research, and leadership to advance justice and inclusive democracy. This mission is on ready display not only in its many public events that inform and enrich our community, but also in its undergraduate Wayne Morse Scholars Program, the Law Fellows Program, Graduate Research Fellows, Resident Scholars, and Project Grants. At a time when dialogue across our political and social divides are too rare, I'm pleased that the Wayne Morse Center's next theme is common ground, cities, towns, and counties confronting shared challenges. I'm particularly thrilled to welcome internationally renowned scholar and democracy expert Danielle Allen to deliver today's address. She is the ideal person to connect the goals of defending democracy and finding common ground. Finally, I want to express my gratitude that you are here on what is a truly spectacular Oregon afternoon. And for Danielle, it's like this 365 days a year here. And that the University of Oregon is a place where this kind of event can happen and bring people together to reflect on our shared democratic future and the possibilities of solving critical problems together. I'll now turn things over to Dan Tichenor, co-director of the Wayne Morse Center.
Now it gives me huge pleasure to welcome a fantastic student to introduce our speaker. Jordan Bowers came to the University of Oregon from Oakland, California. He's a double major in history and political science, and he is also a graduating Wayne Morse Scholar. Wayne Morse Scholars are students who excel academically and also are campus leaders. And like a lot of you here, are also political junkies. They care a lot about public affairs. And so we are delighted to have Jordan introduce for us.
All right, hello everyone. Can you hear me all right? All right, now thank you for the introduction to the introduction. So my name is Jordan Bowers. Now, as a student during these times, it is often very concerning and overwhelming to look at the news and feel powerless. Given the uncertainty today with what is happening in our democracy, I'm very honored to be able to introduce Professor Allen to help us understand what to make of our current situation and what we can all do. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University and director of the Allen Lab for Democracy at the John F. Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She is a past chair of the Mellon Foundation and Pulitzer Prize Board and is the recipient of many prominent honors and awards. These include being selected as a Marshall Fellow and a MacArthur Genius Fellow, being named a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and receiving prestigious awards such as the Francis Parkman Prize and the Library of Congress's John Kluge Award for Lifetime Achievement in Humanities and Social Sciences. Now, Professor Allen is a prolific scholar who has authored many critically acclaimed books. Some of these notable works are Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown v. Board of Education, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, From Voice to Influence, Understanding Citizenship in a Digital Age, Democracy in Time of the Coronavirus, and Justice by Means of Democracy. It's particularly fitting that Dr. Allen is providing the capstone lecture in our Defending Democracy series because her work on democracy takes so many forms, cutting across disciplines and tying them together. She is an extraordinary scholar, nonprofit leader, leading the way on multiple fronts at once. Consider the following. Professor Allen is both a classicist and political theorist, known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. She is forward-looking, serving as a national voice on AI, tech ethics, and citizenship in the digital age. She's an advocate, founding and guiding organizations working to drive progress for healthy, inclusive democracy and for civics education. She has run for statewide public office as UO law professor Wayne Morse did more than 80 years ago. And in this age of polarization, Dr. Allen chaired a bipartisan commission on the practice of democratic citizenship of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, launched to explore how best to respond to the weakness and vulnerabilities in our political and civic life, and to enable more Americans to participate as effective citizens in a diverse 21st century democracy. So, in short, with all that said, Professor Allen is an incredibly accomplished person, and we are very grateful to have you here today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Allen to the University of Oregon.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and it is beautiful. You did this just for me, right? I sat outside by the grass for half an hour and just loved watching the students and basking in the sun. So thank you so much, President Schultz, for the warm welcome, and Professor Tishner and Mr. Bowers for your very, very generous introduction. It is a bit daunting to be the final speaker in a series that you've had on defending democracy. And things have been moving and changing so quickly that I'm sure that you, with me, feel that you're kind of constantly struggling to reassess. I've felt for the last couple of months often, like the GPS thing going, recalculating route, and so forth. So that's what I'm going to do today, is spend some time with you talking about how I've recalculated my route, in all honesty, for the project of defending democracy by renovating democracy. For me, the story of defending our democracy has to be about actually fixing it, because in various ways it hasn't been delivering for us, and I think that's at the core of our problems. But before I get into all of that, let me just back up and share a little bit more about who I am and the perspective I bring to this conversation about the future of our democracy. You heard from Jordan's introduction that I have a lot of balls in the air, and so people often ask me, but Danielle, what do you really do? And my answer to that question is always the same. It's basically that I work on democracy, past, present, and future, with no question mark on the end of that. I like to share that commitment and focus is something I come by very honestly. It's a matter of family inheritance, for starters. So I have a granddad who helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. And I don't know how much you know about Northern Florida, but it's an awful lot like Southern Georgia. And at the time, it was super dangerous. Lynchings were on the rise. So he literally took his life into his hands to do the work of securing the right to vote. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. My great-granddad marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. And my great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. So basically, these are people, I come from people who saw empowerment as the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. And for them, empowerment meant, yes, steering one's own life privately in the private sphere, but also collaborating with others in the public sphere to shape together the public life that provides the sort of housing for all of our possibilities. So steering in private, but co-creating in public the world that we have together. As a young person, I will admit I took the value of that project of democracy for granted. I was fortunate to grow up in a network of just super civically engaged people. But as I watched my own generation coming up in the world, the question of democracy's value got a lot more complicated for me. There was this sort of real fork in the road in life experiences for myself and then some of my cousins. So I have had incredible opportunities. I am a tenured faculty member at a great university. Thank you. We will be great for hundreds of years to come. We will also fix the problems that we have because we too need to renovate ourselves in defending ourselves. But it is a position of incredible privilege to be a tenured faculty member at a great university. And I feel that every single day. And at the same time, I have cousins, so kids I used to run around in the streets playing football with who aren't with us any longer. And for all of the hardest things we struggle with as a society, so substance use disorder, incarceration, gun violence. And I lost my youngest cousin, Michael, in 2009. I often tell this story. It was a moment where it just really stopped me in my tracks and made me come face to face with the fact that at the end of the day, democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable, right? We love the ideals of freedom and equality, but the point is when we embrace them, it's supposed to give us a society that makes it possible for every generation to do a bit better than the previous. And also, really important for me, it should give us a society that makes it possible for every generational cohort to come up together as a complete cohort. So at that moment, I lost my youngest cousin, Michael, in 2009. I realized that what I had been living through, this sort of what I call this experience of pulling apart in my family, where some had great opportunities and others were really trapped in difficult circumstances, this is exactly the same experience that our whole country has had over the course of my lifetime. So my 50 plus years on this planet coincide with the rise of income inequality, the rise of wealth inequality, the rise of incarceration, the rise of polarization. And so putting these pieces together, I began to bang my head on the question of how to change the dynamic of our democracy so that it can deliver on the promise of democracy. And what I did first in those years from 2009 to about 2013 was work on criminal justice reform. And I know this is a state that has also given a lot of thought to criminal justice reform. And in my case, I was also working on trying to affect federal policy change. But as I did that work, the lesson that came home fastest and most completely was that even where there were common sense, cross-partisan solutions to things, you could not get them through because of the dysfunction and polarization in Congress. And I don't know how many of you remember, but in 2013, Congress had an approval rating of 9%. Okay, so it's really, really bad now, not that far off that mark, but the point is, it's been that bad for more than a decade. And that moment for me, 2013, was my red alert moment about the health of our democracy. Congress is, after all, supposed to be our voice, right? So if Congress has an approval rating of 9%, it means we, the people, approve of our own voice, at the rate of 9%. It makes us a self-hating people, which is a terrible idea. And it also just tells us that our institutions are fundamentally broken. So from that moment, I've been working on what I call democracy renovation. The title of my talk today was Bridging the Impasse, Practices for Democracy in the 21st Century. And so what I wanted to do right at the start was to think a little bit about what are exactly the impasses that we are trying to bridge, because there are many impasses that we might be trying to bridge. Now, the story that I've just told already gave a window into some of the impasses we are trying to bridge. For the last few decades, we have been living through incredible economic and social transformation, and that transformation is global. It is partly the story of economic globalization. We are all watching now the effort to undo that globalization by returning manufacturing to the US, but the point is over several decades, jobs moved away, manufacturing moved away as the economy globalized and movements of capital changed, and that was also connected to real shifts in patterns of migration around the globe so that the world now has unprecedented levels of the movements of people. At the same time, we watch this incredible growth in the use of technology that supports all kinds of activities at a much more mass scale than was previously possible in human history, and also complexifies our life, so that everywhere we turn around, we're encountering systems that are going ever more complex, harder and harder for us to navigate. So the first issue that we just face is the fact that our society is facing all kinds of challenges with regard to how exactly we secure a foundation for well-being for all of us. And too many people feel trapped. Right? Trapped with regard to mobility, trapped with regard to access to housing, trapped with regard to access to health in a stable fashion. So that's the first impasse we have. You can just think of as the well-being impasse. We're trying to navigate that particular problem. Now, as these challenges for our society were emerging, we also watched other impasses emerge. The increase of polarization, which has led to paralysis in Congress, reduction in productive legislation, for instance, a transfer of the effort to make decisions from Congress and the legislature to the executive branch in the form of executive orders. Now, executive orders, of course, can be reversed from one generation to the next. And so you get a kind of increasing pace of whiplash back and forth between administrations and an erosion of the sort of stability and predictability that societies actually need in order to do solid and stable problem solving, 1 year after the next. So that's a second impasse that began to develop. I call that one the dysfunction impasse. So we had a problem of well-being being out of reach, and now the tools that we ought to be able to use to address our well-being impasse aren't functioning properly because of polarization causing dysfunction in our core institutions. Alongside that comes another tremendous change, the rise of social media. And I don't need to tell all of you about how significant that is, but a complete reordering of the structure of our communications landscape. That reordering has, of course, made it much easier for people with extreme and fringe views to find each other and coordinate, injecting another element of turbulence into our politics and fueling a plague of misinformation and disinformation that has destabilized the information ecosystem that, again, we need for healthy decision making. So that's a third impasse, the technology impasse. And connected to that, of course, is the incredible power that has been concentrated in tech firms, tech companies. So we're piling up the impasses here, and it's no wonder in such a context that we all feel powerless and uncertain how to get back to a place where we can use our institutions as the tools they should be for solving our very difficult problems. Now, in this context of underlying problems around well-being and dysfunctional institutions, and then a sort of technology coup over our basic architecture of communications and information, all of which is driven with polarization, around the globe, as you know, we've seen the emergence of authoritarian regimes. And you may now all be familiar with the phrase competitive authoritarianism. The idea that in Hungary, in Turkey, in India, we're watching contexts in which elections continue, there's a performance of democratic practices and processes, but those who hold power stay in power in a durable fashion, and they develop a suite of measures and mechanisms to punish enemies, to punish those who object or dissent, and they ultimately erode and degrade the capacities of civil society, consolidating power in the form of highly arbitrary and dominating rule over time. So competitive authoritarian regimes have been rising around the globe. And in January, I was in a position where I was still trying to decide what I thought was happening in this country. Some of you may have seen the optical illusion of the picture that you look at it once and you think it's a duck, and you look at it again and you realize, oh, it could be a rabbit. Do you know what I'm talking about, the duck-rabbit optical illusion? So we've been living through a bit of a duck-rabbit situation in this country. The president has articulated the argument that there should be a unitary executive that is supported by arguments coming out of legal quarters, for example, the Federalist Society. And there's a sense in which it's a reasonable argument. Executive branch power has become diffuse. Agencies have been effectively legislating in unaccountable ways. There's a lot of the story of the executive branch of our government where there are reasonable improvements that you could achieve through a more unitary conception of the executive. But of course, the question is what's being pursued a unitary executive, or is what's being pursued a sort of competitive authoritarian form of government where basic constitutional checks are being eroded? Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? And of course, with Elon Musk's work in the mix as well at Doge, there's a further possibility that Elon Musk himself had a vision for assimilating control of the organs of government through control of its data infrastructure. So we had a complicated question trying to figure out which world were we living in. The nice rabbit world where we had a kind of reasonable approach to achieving a more unitary executive, or the mean and nasty duck world of either competitive authoritarianism with President Trump or with Elon Musk. All right, that was where I was in January. Is it a duck? Is it a rabbit? I'm not going to hide my cards. Now, here in May, I do think we are living in a world where we are watching the consolidation of competitive authoritarianism. And my view about this is based on what the president has been doing with regard to ignoring separation of powers, checks and balances, due process, the key building blocks of limited government. So the important point about those concepts, they're very abstract. We all learned about them in AP US Gov, and then I'm sure that you have been also addressing them in all kinds of further courses here on our college campus. And they're so core to the project of constitutional democracy that they cease to have concrete reality for us. They really come to feel just like abstractions. Oh yes, that's what we do in the US, checks and balances. I was having coffee this morning in a coffee shop, and I was listening to a guy talking on the phone about some business inside his company. So, oh yes, we have to have checks and balances for this and so forth. So just kind of part of our ordinary cliched vocabulary about how we do life in America. It's part of our culture even. It ceases to have concrete meaning. But I think what we're watching right now is the experience that teaches us again what the concrete meaning of checks and balances is. So very specifically, you all saw the viral videos, for example, of the international student at Tufts who was ambushed on the street merely for publishing an opinion piece in the newspaper, and has not yet had appropriate due process treatment of her visa case and her visa status. You all are aware that congressionally legislated appropriations have been unlawfully simply cut off. That is a violation of the first article powers of Congress, for example. So we can go down the line. But there is a consistent picture here which has also been explicitly articulated as a goal by some of the thinkers who are in the circles around the president and vice president. Most prominently, a blogger named Curtis Yarvin, whom you can investigate more fully. He just published a full book laying out his argument, and it's explicit that the goal is to achieve absolute monarchy. Not even limited monarchy, but absolute monarchy. And the argument is that power should be absolutely concentrated in one hand and should be unlimited. It's a very strange argument. And it's not to say that, his arguments necessarily have gone sort of straight into the president's ear or something of that kind. But the book is actually quite chilling because it does really lay out a blueprint for what we are watching in very precise degree. So here we are in May, and I have come to the conclusion that we are watching the development of competitive authoritarianism, that it's a moment that calls on all of us, regardless of our party, our partisan background, to ask the question of how we bridge an impasse, which now has that layered on top of it as well. So let's summarize the impasses, all right? I know it was a beautiful day until Danielle started talking. Okay, right, so we have the underlying social economic transformation, we have polarization, we have institutional dysfunction, we have a tech coup, and on top of that we have competitive authoritarianism. So we have to bridge all those impasses. In a funny way, competitive authoritarianism is how some small number of people are trying to bridge the impasses. Let me explain. That position comes from the view that our institutions have grown so dysfunctional that democracy is discredited. So from their point of view, the first four impasses that I just described, in fact, motivate the case for competitive authoritarianism. So what that means is that if we want to bridge the impasse, if we want to get past this impassable moment, we want to solve for these problems, the first question we have to ask is, how do we want to bridge these impasses? How do we want to navigate past these problems? Do we want to navigate past these problems in such a way as to preserve freedom? Or do we not care about freedom? So literally the first question we have right now is, do we want a free society? So I'm going to check. Do me a favor, please raise your hand if you would like a free society. Thank you. And I don't think that was every single hand, so I want you to be clear. It's a real question, okay? People are currently making different choices. Many people have come to not believe in having a free society, but that is literally the first question. And we need to find everybody, supermajority of people from across the political spectrum, who fundamentally want to bridge the impasse in such a way as to preserve the existence of a free society. All right? So that's really job number one. When we're thinking about the practices of democracy in the 21st century, build a huge, huge, huge community of people who are committed to the idea of a free society. But then if we have that commitment, comes the question of precisely what do we do? How do we put ourselves in a position to tackle the problems that we have? So this is where I turn to the work of democracy renovation. And I'm going to ask you to consider the possibility that defending our democracy is, again, less about exactly, precisely, simply defending a status quo, and more about renovating what we currently have so that it can solve the underlying social and economic challenges. Okay? In other words, to defend it by renovating it so that it can do its job well for us. Now, what do I mean by that precisely? Let me take you back to the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are, of course, very precise legal and philosophical essays in arguing for the case for the new Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison were the authors of them. But what they are also, in an extraordinary way, are a design manual, an articulation of the design principles used for the original creation of the Constitution. So about them, what matters less, honestly, is any of the sort of minute claims about this choice in the Constitution or that choice in the Constitution, and more the design principles that they articulate. And there are two really important design principles that I want to call your attention to: energy and Republican safety, okay? Energy is the principle that the government's got to get something done. It's articulating the same thing I was feeling when my cousin died, and I suddenly thought, you know, democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable. It's supposed to actually make the world better for people, right? Every form of government, it doesn't matter whether it's democracy or monarchy or oligarchy or aristocracy, they are only legitimate, all of them, if they do actually support the safety and happiness of the people, the well-being of the people. So energy is the principle that democracy does actually have to deliver. So we want to be able to defend something that delivers. Okay, that's, you can see where the wrinkle in the puzzle comes in. If it doesn't deliver, we can't defend it. That's why we've got to renovate it. So that's the first principle, energy. Second principle, Republican safety. What does that principle mean? That principle was the phrase that they used at the time to indicate protection of basic rights. Republican safety literally meant protection of your civil liberties, protection of your rights to be a political participant. The two halves of liberty. Philosophers talk about the negative liberties and the positive liberties. The rights of conscience, to write an opinion piece, the rights of religion, the rights to dispose of your own property, your own person. Those are the negative liberties. And then also the positive liberties, the right to vote, to run for office, to serve on a juror, to play a role as a co-creator of our community. So all of those rights need to be protected. That's what you have when you get Republican safety. So one of the things we've been watching in public events for the last few months is a monomaniacal focus on energy. That's what the Department of Government Efficiency is about. Just and only the principle of energy. Which is why we all feel right now like we're being dominated. At least I do. Anybody else? Yeah. Feeling dominated is how you feel when Republican safety has not been achieved, when those basic rights are not being appropriately protected. So we have to provide a counter to the Doge model, some kind of alternative model for renovating our government where we're designing both for energy and for Republican safety. All right? So that's the job. Okay, so how do we do it? We do it, in my argument, by what I call democracy renovation. This is two things. It is reconnecting people to their civic power, experience, and responsibility, and it is also redesigning our institutions so they are actually responsive to us, the people, and get decisions made, and they can implement those decisions effectively. In fact, Professor Tishner and I were talking beforehand about the harm reduction ballot initiative and then the fact that it got repealed after just a year and a half because the implementation nowhere nearly matched the original hopes for the bill. So that would be a good example of not getting all the way through to that process of representation that works, because you don't get a good implementation of a decision once you've taken one. All right? So both halves, reconnecting people again to their civic power, experience, and responsibility, and redesigning our institutions. So about people, you can't have a democracy unless people want a democracy. That's just one of the most basic facts about it. And so in that regard, when one thinks about what it takes to have a democracy, one has to start with people and ensuring that people are expressing that desire together to one another and working together. And more specifically even, one needs a supermajority of people who support the basic norms of healthy constitutional democracy. So I take those basic norms to be constitutionalism, rule of law, nonviolence, and universal inclusion. Now, when I say you need a supermajority that stands up for those norms, what you should realize instantly when I talk about a supermajority is that that supermajority will necessarily be both multiracial and cross-ideological. So the project of building a supermajority for democracy is about building bridges across ideological lines around those core commitments of constitutionalism, rule of law, nonviolence, full inclusion. Shared commitment to the rules of the game. And then we can protect those, we can get back to the big, hard policy fights we have about what's inside the policy space as we fight over economic policy and health policy down the line, okay? But that's the first thing. The work of building a supermajority for democracy has to be about building a cross-ideological, multiracial coalition. And that means, as one is starting to move into the world of doing democracy work, one always wants to ask, wherever one's participating, how can we connect what we're doing to people who are in a different place on the political spectrum? That requires building muscles that many of us don't currently have. I'll come back to that at the very end of my remarks. But before I come back to those practices for all of us in an ordinary, individual way, I want to say a bit more about the work of redesigning our institutions. What we really have to do is recognize that institutions of representation are like the spine of a democracy. It's a central nervous system of a democracy. And you can think of the structures of representation as having three components. There's the part which is about channeling the voice of the people into decision makers. There's the part which is about how decision makers work with each other. And then there's the part about how decisions get implemented, how government services get delivered. And right now, we have weaknesses in each of those components of sort of the spine of representation. Alrighty? So, from my point of view, one of the single most important things we could all do is take a look at our own state governments and start there. And look at your state government in Oregon. I'm looking at my state government in Massachusetts, and consider the question of what can we do to improve citizen voice and its role in decision-making in Oregon? What can we do to help our legislator in Oregon function more effectively? What can we do to help our state officials implement their decisions more effectively? Can we overhaul all of our institutions and get a healthy democracy going at the state level? We often forget in this country that the federal government only exists because state governments send delegations to Washington. And the federal government only exists because state governments establish election systems for sending federal governments to Washington. So the truth of the matter is that the entire health of the federal system depends on choices made in our states. So if we're really serious about renovating the whole thing and getting to a place where our federal government is working better, the place to start is actually by ensuring that we have healthy democracy at the state level, and then that those healthy democracies are making choices about how our election systems work to give us a healthy Washington. In particular, the choice we need state-level healthy democracies to focus on is getting rid of party primaries. You see how the pieces fit together, okay? Because that's where it happens, is at the state level. Now, why do we care to get rid of party primaries? Fewer and fewer people are members of parties. You guys know that, right? Declining membership. Okay, about 50% of Americans are no longer enrolled in a party. But at the same time that we have declining membership in parties, parties have increased their power and control over our political institutions through gerrymandering and other aspects of our political system. The result of this is that many of our elections, I think northward of 80% of our congressional elections, for example, are decided in the primary. They're not competitive in the general. And that means they're decided in the most low turnout context that there is, right? Primaries have very low turnout. So what that means is a very small percentage of our electorate is actually picking who's in office. And this is true for both parties. So you can look at the Republican side. Marjorie Taylor Greene is elected by 8% of the electorate in her district, for example. Other side, AOC is elected by 5% of the electorate in her district. So the point is that once in office, politicians have no accountability to the bulk of the American people. They only have accountability to a very small percentage, and being primaried is the single thing that they most have to fear, which gives them an incentive to polarize in their politics inside Congress and reduces their ability to make decisions. All right? To make this very concrete, there's a set of states all around you, California, Washington, Alaska, also Louisiana, farther afield, that have already gotten rid of party primaries. And when we look at decision-making for their congressional delegations compared to other states with primaries, there is a noticeable pattern that emerges. Take the debt ceiling deal that Biden had to get through. That was a tough and important compromise that we needed to get through Congress. And for the vote on that, for the Republicans who were from those states without party primaries, 90% of them voted for the debt ceiling deal. In contrast, in the state with primaries, 60% of those Republicans voted for the debt ceiling deal. In other words, without the operations of party primaries, low turnout party primaries, politicians have more room for decision-making to actually find their way to a solution that's in the public interest as opposed to in the most narrowly conceived version of the interests of the party. All right? So party primaries, if we could get rid of those, have all candidate primaries, give politicians incentives to be accountable to the whole people, that would change our federal system. But how do we get that? We get that at the state level. The only way we can get that at the state level is if we have an actually functioning, healthy democracy at the state level where people are actively involved, there's a high degree of civic participation and engagement. If we work hard and get a healthy legislature, maybe we can get those changes through the legislature. Sometimes it takes changes through a ballot initiative, et cetera. But I think of this work at the state level where we need to try to build a supermajority for democracy and also rewire our institutions of representation as basically giving democracy a heart transplant. Okay? So that's the work I think we need to do. And the last piece I want to say about this project of democracy renovation and that work of rewiring representation is it's partly about institutional changes, getting rid of party primaries, for example. Or in Massachusetts, we need same-day voter registration because we have a real problem with low voting registration rates for communities of color in Massachusetts. We are below the national average for every community of color in the state. Folks wouldn't guess that about Massachusetts, but it's true. So we need changes like that, but also at the same time, precisely because of the impact of technology on our world, another part of the renovation work that we need to do is about figuring out how to deploy technology for good. Technology is a dual use instrument. It can be used for bad, for good. The Doge model, again, is not the only model for putting technology to work to try to address the dysfunction of our government. We can also put technology to work increasing support for people's participation in government, increasing the quality of deliberation among legislators. There's lots of great tools now to support deliberation in a variety of ways, surfacing more knowledge about the range of possible points of connection underlying disputes so that you could open up problem-solving space. We can also use technology to improve services. There's lots of work to do to improve how algorithms are designed to support pro-social behavior. So in other words, we can take a project of designing for both energy and Republican safety even into the space of thinking about how we use technology in government, okay? And we must do that because the power of new AI tools is so significant that unless we figure out how to put them to work for democracy, those who have decided to bridge this impasse with competitive authoritarianism will simply keep driving the use of technology in the direction of autocratic control. All right? On this point, let me give you one last piece before we go back to the question of the people, what we, the people, can do trying to form a supermajority. I want you to pay attention to a new law in Utah, just passed by Spencer Cox, or signed by Spencer Cox. It's called the Data Choice Act. And this is an act that requires people to own their own data on platforms, including their social graph. So including everybody that you are connected to on your online platforms. You have to be able to take that with you when you leave the platform. It requires that you be able to get anything you want deleted by the social media companies about you. And it also requires interoperability across platforms. So think about email, for example. You can write an email on one platform and send it to somebody else receiving it in another platform. Social media should work in the same way with that kind of cross-platform interoperability. That would unlock the dominance of tech on our communications infrastructure. It would put power back in the hands of ordinary citizens. So that's another good example of what we can do to renovate our institutions. And again, it's at the state level. Okay, so that is the institutional picture of what we need. If we can drive that change at the state level, get rid of party primaries, we stand the chance of giving ourselves a Congress that could actually reform at the federal level as well. Supreme Court term limits, a bigger House of Representatives, a bunch of other things that would help us have a more effective democracy, still protective of our core rights. All right, so for my last few moments of remarks, I want to come back to this question of what it means for each of us to do the work of helping to build a supermajority for constitutional democracy. And often, because I do a lot of work on democracy, as a professor, also through an organization called Partners in Democracy, people often ask me what they should do. How can they help? And it's taken me a long time to understand a basic feature of the right answer. Often, when people ask that question, there's a certain kind of hope or expectation that there's one action that one person can do, and I can tell the person, do this action, and it will make this kind of difference. As if in our democracy, each of us is individually, as an atom, connected to our political institutions. But that is not, in fact, the case. The first thing each of us needs to do is join a group. Okay? Literally, join a group. Political scientists would say that democracies depend on what we like to call mediating organizations, okay? That any given individual, in order to be civic, really needs to become part of a group in order to do that work. So you can join Common Cause, or you can join the League of Women Voters, or you can join Indivisible, or you can join an issue-specific kind of advocacy group, or you can join your political party, your local Republican Party, or your local Democratic Party. But the reason it matters to join a group is because what a group is a way of dividing the intellectual labor that it takes to participate in politics. This stuff is hard. Our institutions are complicated. It's really hard to understand them and hard to know where to make a difference. But what groups do is develop that knowledge and store it over time and orient everybody who joins their group into that knowledge and makes it really easy to participate. All right? So the very first thing you could do to help renovate our democracy in order to defend it is join a group that is working in some fashion on our democracy. And that group will have lots and lots of actions for you to do. There's a new map called the Healthy Democracy Ecosystem Map. It's put out by the National Civic League. It's mapping groups by state. Go have a look. Find a group that's interesting to you. And I'm sure you are kind of a crowd that's probably already in lots and lots of groups. But tell others, when they ask you what to do, tell them, join a group, all right? And then, if we can all join groups, and if we can all understand and take in our groups the narrative about the need to renovate our democracy, and to do that by building a supermajority committed to the norms of constitutionalism, rule of law, nonviolence, full inclusion, and if we've got those groups all over the country, we will save our democracy. It is actually as simple as that, okay? So, but I mean, it's just, it sounds silly for me to emphasize so much how important it is to join a group, but it really isn't what we expect as the answer when we ask what we can do. And it's precisely the fact that that's unfamiliar as an answer that it's time for us to overcome. But that is what it takes. And in the story of democracies that backslide and then are able to reverse it, India, in the context of Indira Gandhi, Poland, more recently, the way that backsliding has been reversed is precisely because civil society, which is the space of freedom, stays strong. And civil society, many, many different and not formally coordinated groups, nonetheless start figuring out how to link and connect and build a really big cross-ideological coalition. So it really is literally the most valuable thing we can do. That means then that we need a few skills and habits in order to do that work of joining groups and connecting our groups to other groups. And I call these above all the skills of confident pluralism, all right? This is a big country. We are so different from each other. Actually, the phrase is from a law professor called John Inazu, but at any rate, he said I could use it, okay? I want you all to know that. So, confident pluralism is the ethic that goes with this work of being a part of a group in this big context of defending democracy. To be a confident pluralist means you know what you stand for, what you value and why. You've been reflective about that. You've figured it out. And you've learned how to listen to what other people value. And you've learned how to approach moments of dispute and conflict by bringing values to the surface and exploring, are there some possibilities we haven't seen yet that would let us align values to do some work together? And the core values I just gave you around defending democracy are the kinds of values that actually can come to the surface in a lot of different sorts of ideological quarters and give us a way of hooking up our work to each other and prioritizing that work, again, of defending our democracy by renovating it. So a project, an ethic of mutual respect, holding sacred the human dignity of the others that we are working with in this democracy, regardless of our degree of disagreement with them, those are at the core of the work we have to do to save our democracy. At the end of the day, regardless of how big this country is, regardless of how powerful those institutions seem, we are actually more powerful. But the question of whether or not we activate our power depends entirely on a question of the spirit and culture we bring to it. Do we claim the project of freedom as our project? That's the question. And if we claim the project of freedom as our project, then we need this ethos of confident pluralism for how we work on building that big supermajority for democracy. Thank you very much for your time.
So thank you, Professor Allen. We have time for your questions. And I think we'll start off from the audience. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. I'll come find you. Shay, I'm coming to you.
Hi, my name's Shay. Thanks for being here.
Nice to meet you.
I'm in a book club right now with the Wayne Morse Scholars, and a lot of stuff that we've been talking about lately is the partisanship that's caused by the fact that we don't have community groups that aren't tied to politics and partisanship. Do you think that's part of the reason that we're so polarized, is that we don't have those community groups that traditionally we used to have?
That's a great question. I'm sure it's a contributing factor, absolutely. So a healthy society, democratic society, is one that's really good at generating bridging ties as well as bonding ties. And yes, I mean, it is often affinity groups that don't relate to any of the big cleavages are really excellent for creating bridging ties. So whether that's a gardening club or a surfing club, hiking club, etc. Yes, those are very valuable for giving us that opportunity. And so so when I say join a group, and I gave you a list of civic groups, they don't have to be exclusively civic. It would even be valuable to join other kinds of groups that are affinity groups and the like. But we do also need a lot of joining of civic groups right now.
So our next question is coming from text.
Yes, and this follows up well on Shay's question. Okay, well, I'm still
There's another
curious.
version of it.
I'm curious. How do labor unions fit in?
Was that your question? Oh, okay. Yeah. So no, super interesting. Great question. So labor unions are really important for sure for joining. There's an interesting pattern. There's a new book out by a political scientist. I can't remember her name. I think it's just out at Princeton, which has studied both labor unions and religious organizations. And I haven't read it yet. I've only heard it described to me. But my understanding of the argument is that what she found is that states that have had a durable tradition of labor unions have become very blue states, and states that have had sort of durable religious institutions have become very red states, and the states without either have become apathetic states. So that speaks, though, to the importance of mediating institutions, but it also speaks to the importance of having a kind of diverse tissue of kinds of mediating organizations so that the society can be woven together as a connected society and not a polarized society. So we need labor unions and faith groups in the same place, I think, is sort of answer to that question.
Hi, I want to thank everyone here for being in this collective. And I mentioned that, and thank you for being here. I mentioned that because I felt this tension when you said join a group, be part of the collective.
Yeah.
And we're increasingly in an isolated society, and so getting into those groups is really scary for folks. And so I'm wondering what we can do as in this higher education, being a professor, being a student, working with our peers. How can we engage with some of the challenges that come with being part of a collective that we need?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I would love to ask it back to you and ask you what you think and what your suggestions are. I hope it would be a question that we could all collectively think about. I'll throw out a few things. First of all, could everybody who has a phone in your hand raise your phone up in the air for a second? Just lift your phone up. Okay, that there be a pack of cigarettes. Kid you not. I'm on 4 packs a day. Think about your phone as a pack of cigarettes. Ask yourself, really, how do you want to use your phone? So first we have to make space for each other, right? By cracking the addiction to some of the kinds of things that are degrading our ability to be with other people. And then because we've let ourselves degrade in that way, we do have to, I think, intentionally start to rebuild our ability to be in groups. And so in my classes, I make my students be in random groups with people they don't know, all the time. And they hate it at first. It is a form of torture, is their experience. But I just totally randomize them, and I make them, introduce themselves to each other. I just make them do all the kinds of things you have to do when you're kind of joining a new group with new people. And obviously at colleges, campuses, we do that all the time because we're doing that in orientation and onboarding and things like that. But sort of we do it in orientation, and then people make their friends, and then we stop supporting that. So every class I teach, I try to get the students mixed up again and so forth. And I think I don't have the full answer, but I would just open up the space for creativity. I thank you for the space for creativity for us all to reflect on that.
Another texted question that I think a number of people in the audience and watching online will have. So democratic capitalism is inherently exploitative, and reform efforts may only serve to mask the underlying issues rather than address them. What do you say to critics who say reforming broken systems isn't enough and a new system must be created?
All righty. Okay. Somebody was going to ask me that question. Fair enough. Fair enough. So for starters, I think it's really important that we separate thinking about the economic system from thinking about the political system. All right? So democracy is one word, capitalism is another word. They may or may not be glued together. So that's for starters. And so we have a huge host of economic problems. I want to agree with that. We are basically living in another Gilded Age. And it's interesting that the last Gilded Age of the 19th century was followed by a huge raft of reforms to democracy, direct election of senators, women getting the right to vote, and so forth. So I do expect that this Gilded Age will be followed by another raft of reforms to our democracy. Now, that doesn't answer the question about the underlying economic issues. The underlying economic issues, I would argue, reflect, this will not be a new claim for any of you, but reflect the consequences of a neoliberal paradigm for political economy. A paradigm that, for starters, thinks that economic policy should be only about the continuum between the market and public sector, forgetting about civil society, so a sort of third piece of the three-legged stool that we can use for solving collective action problems and the like, and also drive so hard in the direction of the market that often is undermining public goods that we need to provision either through the public sector or through activating civil society mechanisms. And of course, the way we've approached trade liberalization, movement of capital and things like that have undermined development for a lot of people, pushing people out of the productive economy and letting wealth get captured by a very small number of people. From my point of view, those have been results that have flowed from, again, a political economy paradigm, not from democracy itself. And I think it's possible to move into a different kind of economic paradigm. I call it power sharing liberalism, other people call it other things, but it's an economic paradigm that starts by remembering to put questions of power back into the analysis for economic thinking. When you think about the labor market, you've got to think about the place of power in principal-agent relations. You can go down the line in the ways in which there are key theoretical ideas that shift if you reintroduce the concept of power. And there are various, the Utah Act that I mentioned is a way of tackling the economic power, actually, of big tech by thinking about power in the first instance. That's a way of restructuring the economy. Wes Moore has some really interesting legislation in Maryland, which is also about doing work to reintegrate people into the productive structure of the economy based on, in the first instance, again, sort of reorganizing how people approach power relations and around decision-making at municipal level, county level, and things like that. So there's a world of work that's starting to emerge that offers us a very different paradigm for how we think about economic policy than we have had for the last 3 decades. And so I am all in favor of a new paradigm for political economy, and I think that can go with democracy. The new paradigm does continue to think that markets are valuable, and the public sector is valuable, and civil society is valuable, and you need different combinations of those mechanisms operating for different kinds of collective action or public goods problems. So anyway, I defend a system where democracy and markets do stay connected to each other, but I think that there is fundamental transformation possible in our economy that would mean that the kind of union between democracy and markets has a very different kind of outcome and effect than our current situation. Sorry, that was a very long answer, I apologize.
A great one.
Hello. Okay. I missed the first portion of your talk because I had a midterm, so I apologize if this is redundant in any way, but I have kind of a 2-part question. The first is about, you talk about having a free society, and my first question would be, what exactly does a free society constitute? What does that look like? And then my second question would be whether you think that democracy in America has historically provided a free society, or what that would look like in the future as well.
Great. No, thank you. Terrific questions. So for starters, it's important to recognize that freedom does have different definitions. And over time, there have been different definitions of it that have been dominant in the political discourse in this country. So if you go all the way back to the 18th century, the definition of freedom that was in the ascendant was the one that I was using today, where it has two halves: protection of negative liberties and protection of positive liberties. So those freedoms of conscience, freedom of person, freedom of religion, being negative liberties, and sometimes people describe those as being free from interference by the government. And then there are also the positive liberties, which people describe as being free to do things, so empowerment basically, so freedom to vote, run for office, in other ways take a role as a decision maker around shared public decisions. So for me, freedom is both of those things together, and it amounts to being free from domination, not being subject to somebody else's arbitrary will. For various reasons I won't bore you with right now, in the 19th century and early 20th century, freedom got split into its two halves, the negative liberties half and the positive liberties half, and the freedom from interference concept came to dominate. So you'll all be very familiar with people just saying, like, yeah, freedom's about like the government just like getting off my back, right? It's just about like small government, like get government out of here, and so forth. And from my point of view, that is a limited and partial conception of freedom. It's lost the second positive liberties part, and it's no longer about freedom from domination. It's too limited in its conception. So my definition of freedom is freedom from domination. There's more that can be said there. This country, for sure, has been extremely imperfect in its protection of freedom. For starters, simply like limiting its protections of people who had access to freedom for a very, very long period in time, and continues to be imperfect without any question, though we have made considerable improvements in our protections of freedom for people. So plenty of work to do, for sure, but my own view is that the historical errors and failings don't invalidate the value of the concept. They simply mean that there's a balance of accounts where there's a sort of charge of failure with regard to our earlier efforts doesn't affect the value of the project.
Like many communities and states here in Oregon, we just lost a major newspaper in Eastern Oregon. And so this question is, the timing is good on this one. Do you have suggestions about what, if anything, can be done for or about low information voters who seem to stand in the way of a vibrant, effective democracy?
So let's make not low information voters the problem. Let's make the information ecosystem that they're in the problem, I would say, for starters. And so I'm going to give you a group to join. One of my favorite groups coming out of Chicago is a group called Documenters. And I don't know if it's made it to Oregon yet or not. But this is an organization that recruits people to document what's happening in mostly municipal decision-making contexts, city council meetings, school board meetings, things like that, and basically gives people training effectively in just kind of standard professional standards for journalism, and is rebuilding local news through this method. I mean, it's a combination of a kind of paid structure and volunteer structure, and it has the effect of actually disseminating standards for what counts as sound information far and wide. So that's just one example, but I think there are ways in which what we can do is improve the information ecosystem and pull people back into experiences with high quality journalism. And that's what I would recommend we focus on.
Professor Allen, thank you for your remarks, and I found much of what you said, it seems a little like messed up from my ears, but
sounds good up here. You're
okay,
fine.
Good. So you described several impasses that are preventing us from having the kind of democracy that we want, and some of your solutions seem very on point, particularly joining a group. However, my concern is that in talks like this, they invariably ask certain people to kind of bridge the gap when other sides are less interested in doing that. So, for example, this impasse in terms of the government working, there's a lot of research on bureaucracies that finds that many of the bureaucracies function suboptimally by design, on purpose, because there are actors in the process of making the laws that create the bureaucracies that they don't want to make the bureaucracy, so they can't stop it, but they can undermine it through design. And then, a slightly different example would be in 2016, Democrats and liberals were very interested in understanding the people who voted for Trump. After Trump lost in 2020, a lot of his voters were saying, F Joe Biden. And there was less empathy and interest in trying to bridge the divide by that group than I think that Democrats were inclined to after 2016. And so there seems to be an asymmetry that between various groups in terms of trying to resolve these problems, and a fundamental disagreement on the way in which to do this. This goes back to the positive and negative liberties. Well, if one part of the government or one major political party is not interested in using the government to do positive things in the first place, then it's really difficult to have a conversation about how to make the government do something because that group is less interested. So how do we reconcile these asymmetric perspectives?
Great, terrific question, thank you. So one of the challenges is that there are multiple ways we can evaluate who we are as a people and what our actual degree of polarization is. And some of our indicators point in opposite directions from each other. So, for example, if you look at state ballot propositions around the country, it's actually surprising how often people achieve cross-ideological supermajority results for things that would surprise a person. So like in Florida, 2018, re-enfranchisement of people who had completed service of their felony convictions was about 66, roughly just under 65% of people voted for that. That was a cross-partisan effort. Mississippi, 70% of folks voted for a new state flag to get rid of the old emblems of the Confederacy and use forward-facing iconography. Lots of the cannabis bills around the country, lots of the reproductive freedom efforts around the country have had either supermajorities or really robust majorities in a cross-partisan way. So I introduce all those examples to prove that it can be done, okay? So in other words, the supermajority is actually out there and can form around core values. The sort of cases I've just named are all forming around values of fairness, inclusion, and sticking up for the person getting the short end of the stick. So that doesn't mean that there aren't also other aspects of the asymmetry that you've described. And to some extent, there is a gap between what our national elections tell us and what the media landscape tells us, and what is also true in a state level context. One of the challenges with our national politics is that the choices we make in national politics come as a result of that sort of structure of partisan capture that I described. So we have more extreme choices ultimately at that level, and so that produces a picture of our being more polarized than we actually are in terms of the spread of our opinion. And there's a heck of a lot of polling that also supports the idea that around a whole range of kind of the core values I've been talking about, there is supermajority support for these things. Even, for example, polling on civic education, there is supermajority support for teaching African American history, history of enslavement, history of race, things like that. So this is one of the puzzles of America right now, is that these indicators go in opposite directions from each other. So given that, then the question is, what's a person to do? So my own view, what I do, is I experiment. I say the same things to conservatives as I'm saying here. I say to conservatives that they have to build bridges. So I don't put the burden just on one side by any stretch of the imagination. And I personally have found conservatives who are willing to make those bridges. So for example, in the work I do in Massachusetts, we've been building a network of what we call democracy renovation and learning communities, and have them for different stakeholder groups. So labor and business and students or young people and democracy activists and community organizations in our majority-minority cities, and also a right-of-center group. And we have actually pulled everybody into the same conversation. So I guess what I'm saying is, my personal experience is that people on the right do actually also see the problems in our democracy. Not all of them, by any stretch of the imagination, I would never claim that, but enough of them do. And all we need is a supermajority. We don't need everybody.
Larry Diamond, who spoke on campus last week, said that democracy was not built to absorb the shock of the accelerated immigration we're experiencing today. I was hoping you could speak to this, if you agree or disagree, and how this impacts democracy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and I agree basically that the again unprecedented levels of migration that we're seeing around the whole globe is one of the issues that all democracies are struggling to navigate. And so, from my point of view, I mean, we were talking about this previously, being able to actually produce space for real forward-looking thought and conversation about immigration is really important. I think that there's some promise in the Canadian sponsorship models of immigration, and if one could, the Biden administration did some experimenting with those models. If it were possible to scale them up, there would be value in that. Because at the end of the day, what we are struggling with is both how to make mobility fair, which is about making labor fair. If capital can move and labor can't move, you have a fundamental unfairness. But by the same token, it's very hard to incorporate high rates of migration. And so the question is, can you find a way of finding a kind of sweet spot between those two things? And it's possible that sponsorship, which supports incorporation, might help make it easier for countries to incorporate migrants at rates that support fairness for labor. But that was also a long answer, I apologize.
I have a very basic question. Would you say a word about money in politics? I feel like, do we need to get rid of Citizens United in order to have a hope of renovating democracy? All the groups that I've joined so far seem to ask me for money as opposed to my full-fledged participation. Yeah. So is that a hurdle that we have to overcome?
I have a lot of complicated thoughts on this one, I'll be honest. And I've started saying to people, we need a different vocabulary for this issue, because the truth is, you can't do politics without money. You can't do it. Because you gotta, if nothing else, you gotta pay for the hot dogs at the barbecue, okay? So what you really want is a place where money in politics functions like a barn raising. That money is about people pooling their resources in order to amplify their voices and so forth. The problem is obviously the huge amounts of money, corporate money, dark money, and so forth. But I do feel like we need a slightly different vocabulary so we can make that distinction between barn raising money and corporate money and dark money and so forth. So having said that, I mean, yes, we do need to undo Citizens United. And there are two efforts underway that are really important. Let me give you some more things you could potentially join if you'd like to. There's an organization called American Promise, which is in fact recruiting volunteers all over the country to move a constitutional amendment to make it that corporations no longer count as persons. We need that. It's a great thing. They were making terrific progress prior to this election. This certainly has set them back without any question. But they were really making good progress. They were getting a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to sign on to supporting moving this amendment forward. The opportunity will come. I think this is a window of time that we're in. It's not dead by any stretch of the imagination. So American Promise, that's a group you can join. There's also another group called, I think, Free Speech for the People. I think that's what they're called. They're working on a new law that has now passed in Minnesota and Maine, which prohibits political expenditure by corporations that have more than a certain percentage of foreign ownership share, which gets rid of basically all multinationals, and it takes 85% of corporate money out of politics. So it doesn't require a constitutional amendment, just state legislation. See, that's what I mean. Healthy democracy at the state level. Get that law in all states, solve the corporate money and politics problem, right? So yes, so thank you. So American Promise or Free Speech for the People are two organizations who are working on those things.
Where should we be on the spectrum between being a completely compliant culture versus being all about the individual in order to have a healthy society, and how might we get there?
Wow, that's an interesting question. All right. I'm sorry, I have to think about that one. That's so interesting. I'm trying to understand. I'm sorry I can't talk to the person who asked the question, because I would want to ask some questions back. Because I guess I don't think that the contrast is between being compliant and being individualistic. And the story that I'm telling, or the account I'm offering, is one where there's a recognition of basic human moral equality. That is to say, what we share as human beings is we're all trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. That is a concrete realization of our moral capacity and the fact that through our choices, again, we're striving every day to make tomorrow better than yesterday. And that is an expression of our freedom, that we do this and that we desire to steer our own lives, and then that we can extend our freedom by steering what we share alongside others. And so that account, I suppose it can sound individualistic because I'm talking about individual person being free, but the point is that freedom, as I am offering you an account of it here, freedom from domination, is as much about what we do with others through our positive liberties as it is about what we do in our private sphere. So my conception of freedom is never a completely individualistic conception. So in that regard, I would want to start by, inviting a conversation about what would it take to move from that kind of individualistic conception of freedom to that conception, which is about, again, both my private autonomy, but also my sharing and public autonomy with others and being in groups to do that work. And then comes the question of, well, where does compliance fit into that? Rule of law, yes, compliance to rule of law matters, but the point that I'm trying to make about the role of rule of law is that it gives us a structure for limited government and protection of rights. And so in that regard, rule of law and complying with it is actually about opening up and preserving the space of freedom. It's not antithetical to freedom. So.
Great. So we have two last questions, and I'm going to bundle you guys. So if you can, since you're sitting right next to each other, so you can go first.
Thank you. My question is going back to your discussion about party primaries. We've had some recent experience here with voting on the smart voting system. There are other models, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the models for different voting systems.
And can you just tell me what the smart voting system is? I don't immediately recognize that.
I'm going to leave that to others in the room.
I bet Professor Tishner can tell us.
Alaska.
Okay, so it's a top 4 system specifically, or just ranked choice voting?
Ranked choice.
Ranked choice voting. And did you guys had a ballot measure for RCV statewide? What kinds of races? It went through? No. Oh, it didn't go through. It was for statewide offices or all state offices, also for federal races? Just state races? And so it gets very nitty-gritty, right, when you start talking about election systems. Was it for, and you guys have party primaries here. Do you have a lot of candidates in your party primaries for the two parties? Not many? So is it the kind of thing where you wouldn't have had many people to rank? Yeah, okay, that's what happened in Massachusetts too. We had a ballot measure for, I'm a supporter of ranked choice voting. I think it's excellent. I think it's a very valuable tool for a better election system. But in our case, we have the fewest contested elections in the country in Massachusetts. So it's like, there's not only is there nothing to rank, there's like nobody on the ballot. All right? So it lost because it wasn't solving the problem we had. The problem we had was we don't have contested elections. And so that's why for us, in Massachusetts in particular, the right first solution is getting rid of party primaries so that every election, primary in general, will be contested. And reactivating kind of the dynamic energy of elections so you can hold legislators accountable. And basically, in my own view, the Alaska model is the sort of North Star that we should all be trying to get to. That's, all candidate primary in the first round. 4 voters move forward to the second round. And the reason that's better is because it really does give you diversity of voice in the campaign and opens up the space for third parties to have a meaningful shot at making a difference in things. In Alaska, already it is the case that very often those top 4 elections do turn into top 2 elections. They don't all have 4 candidates in them in the final round. And that will be the case, that's sort of the equilibrium. But at the margins, it does mean when there are those people there with a passion and a purpose, you could have those 4 in the final round, and that is better from the point of view of a robust public agenda and debate. So yes, I think of Alaska as the North Star, but you gotta look at your state and be very specific about the context, understand what's the problem holding back the health of your democracy. In Massachusetts, we don't have any candidates. We need candidates, that means we need a competitive system, that means get rid of party primaries for us. Your picture might look a little different.
Hi. I just wanted to say to begin with, I really have loved a lot of the points that you've made, especially kind of that emphasis on state government. I grew up in Sacramento, California, so really just like immersed in that state government atmosphere, and I think we often forget about the power of the state government. But I also think there's a side to this kind of argument and perspective where what you've said has a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance. And that's what I'm sitting here loving, all of the ideas that you're kind of trying to hold, all these values that you're trying to kind of create and create that space for people. But at the end of the day, in 2 years, right, we're gonna need some visionaries. We're gonna need some people that will run for the presidential office that has a bunch of power, that has power that's probably going to be more consolidated in 2-3 years than it is right now. And I'm wondering how you see someone building kind of a platform and a movement that can encompass all of this complexity, encompass this nuance, encompass these many viewpoints, and actually make people feel included. Because a lot of the times I think our problem right now is this really radical viewpoint is governing our politics, because it's only the radical viewpoints that can get that 40% of people, that 50% of people that you need in order to grab that larger capture. And that's really all you do need to kind of get those larger powers. And as much as we can say that the power lies in the states, right, we're watching how much power the federal government has and how much of a visceral kind of effect it can have on the entire nation. So we need someone to unify that. And how do you see them being able to do that while holding kind of this complexity and nuance and all these different viewpoints?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to say something that's going to just prove to you guys I'm completely weird and so totally removed from real politics that you should really not listen to me. But anyway, so my proposed ticket is Moore Cox or Cox Moore. They should flip a coin for who's on top of the ticket. Okay, Spencer Cox, Republican Utah, Wes Moore, Democrat Maryland. They have 2 of the most visionary sort of policy agendas in their states of any governors. They both have the new picture of what we need for the economy. They both have a picture of commitment to building bridges across ideologies and things like that. So at any rate, like I said, I know you're like, there, how, what, how would it possibly happen? But just think about it. What would the world be like where a governor like Spencer Cox, a governor like Wes Moore, were running together on the same ticket, flipped a coin for who was top of the ticket? Anyway, that's probably enough. Thank you.
Perfect.